Hi folks, welcome to my presentation called Rewilding America. My name is Steve Bush and I will be walking you through the process of rewilding and showing you how it has not only influenced our federal lands management policy, but it has become our federal lands management policy. I'm not going to share my bio here because that would just take too long. Let me just say that I was a rewilder myself back in the 1970s before they came up with a fancy term for it. Today, there are entire colleges devoted to rewilding. The field of conservation biology sounds a lot more legitimate, but don't be fooled. Conservation biology is not a legitimate science, but rather a value-laden belief system working towards rewilding objectives. I prefer to use the term rewilding because it is much more descriptive. I'm going to be talking about a wide range of topics, from large carnivore recovery and critical habitat designations to gap analysis, and landscape conservation cooperatives. We'll look at our binational, trinational, and international treaty obligations, as well as tell you what steps must be taken to get us back to a common sense, multiple-use, human-friendly lands policy. Rewilding is, of course, the major threat to private property rights in this country. That said, I'm still an advocate for protecting public lands and wilderness areas. I spent a large part of my life in the backcountry, and I've never been in a wilderness area I didn't like, or I've never been in the backcountry and said, gee, I wish there was a strip mall here. Well, I'm for wise use, sustainable use, and multiple use of public land. In contrast, rewilding is a single-use agenda. So let's get to it, and let's learn about rewilding and why we need to derail this agenda. Okay, let's start with the definition. Rewilding means to restore an area of land to its natural uncultivated state. In other words, it is a process, and it usually involves a large carnivore either being reintroduced or having its range extended. I was an early advocate for grizzly recovery back in the 1970s, and we didn't really have a fancy term for it, but Michael Soleil in 1978 and Reed Noss developed three independent features and defined rewilding as large, strictly protected core reserves, connectivity, and keystone species. The three C's of rewilding, all you have to remember is it's a three-legged stool: cores, corridors, and carnivores. We're going to talk about cores and corridors first. Those are the land management issues, the protected wilderness areas and protected corridors. Both are equally important. We have a lot of core areas in this country, and the big push now is to establish corridors between those core areas. Alright, let's take a look at a sample core area. That's a 2016 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Critical Habitat Designation for frogs and toads. Very massive area in California that's just been stamped on a map. So what does this mean when something like this gets stamped on a map? Well, there's a lot of different land classifications inside this zone. Obviously, we have some national parks, we have wilderness areas, a lot of national forests, national monuments, a lot of private property. We have agriculture, we have towns, we have roads, we have dams and bridges. There's a lot of structures in here. So when you have a core area like this, it's not an entirely roadless area. So what does it mean, and how does it fit into rewilding? Critical habitat designations come with a whole bunch of regulations or hoops that you have to jump through. Let's just take a look at a couple of those. If you're a national forest supervisor and you've got some fire management, some thinning projects that you want to do, or even some logging, heaven forbid, you're going to have to come up with, as part of your planning process, mitigation strategies to show that your project is not going to harm frogs and toads. Livestock grazing, that's another one. We're seeing the impacts already with watering holes being fenced off, so that if you have an allotment, if you're a cattle producer or sheep producer, you're going to have to be trucking water up to your animals. They're not going to be able to get access to the watering holes on the forest or in this critical habitat designation because they might step on frogs or toads. Introduce fish. That's a big one for me. I've been watching this for at least probably 30 years now. You can go to my blog page and read what I think about that. But basically, there's a huge push in the Sierras to sterilize lakes that were planted with trout back in the 1930s. There's a beautiful fishery up in those mountains, but historically those lakes and those alpine basins were fishless, so they are sterilizing those lakes again with chemical applications and antibiotics and gill netting. And that's not just the lakes, it's the waterways as well. So that's taking place in order to protect frogs and toads and return the area into what it used to be 200 years ago, before we decided that fishing was a great recreational activity up in the backcountry. Roads. Obviously, you're not going to be able to build any roads that might impact frogs and toads. And water development and diversion. We're talking about California. So they've just had a season of floods after many years of drought. Building a new dam or any kind of water diversion project is going to have to be put on hold. It's basically it's not going to happen. So these are huge impacts that are they start out with these regulations, and they become more and more intrusive as people see how this affects them, just by having a proclamation like this stamped on a map. Okay, let's get started with grizzly bear recovery. We're going to spend about a third of this presentation talking about grizzly bears. It's a big deal up here in the Northwest and actually all through the western United States. And the first thing we're going to look at is the North Cascades Grizzly Bear Recovery Area. If you live in Washington State, this is a very big deal. A lot of people really don't know how big a deal this is, but we're talking about 9,000 square miles of our state. Our state is about 71,000 square miles, so this is a fairly significant portion of the entire state. And inside this zone, you'll see the North Cascades National Park is in the dark green, and a lot of the other land is national forest. But we're also looking at whole towns being swallowed up, lots of private property. We're extending out to the agriculture areas in eastern Washington, the apple orchards. As we get further south, we've got corn, we've got all kinds of things. We've got lots of grazing allotments, lots of sheep, lots of cattle. And then if you go over on the western boundary of the zone, you get into the King County all the way up to Everett and Bellingham. Also a lot of agriculture, but also a lot of people living there. We're going to take a look at this whole area and what it means to have grizzly bears translocated, being dumped into this area until we have a minimum number of 200 bears. And we're going to just look at the bigger picture of grizzly bear recovery. So this is our starting point. Well, before we get too much into grizzly bear recovery, I need to get a couple of facts straight. First off is that the brown or the grizzly bear is listed by the IUCN as a species of least concern. It has a massive circumpolar range. There are tens of thousands, uncountable numbers of grizzly and brown bears in the world. They are not an endangered species. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Grizzly Bear Recovery Plan for the North Cascades has been in the works for several decades. The final draft EIS, Environmental Impact Statement, was released January 2017. The public comment period was extended out to April 28th. The comments are running extremely favorable to the plan. There are 4 alternatives in the draft EIS. Alternative D calls for the most bears to be released in the shortest time frame, about 7 bears per year until we reach the 200 bear target number, and then bears will stop being translocated, or at least that's what we're being told. Of course, the bears will be reproducing the whole time, so it's hard to say how many bears will end up in the North Cascades. But augmentation, some folks understand that there are some problems with that word, translocation, augmentation, when it comes to Washington state law, but we'll take a look at that here on the next slide. Now, we do have a law in Washington State that says grizzly bears shall not be transplanted or introduced into the state. I don't think this law is going to be of any effect. We're talking about federal employees moving a federally listed species from one area of federal land into another area of federal land. And in order to invoke this law, you're going to have a governor who wants to go up against the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to prevent this from happening. With probably close to 80% approval rating for translocating bears into Washington State, as the public comments are showing and all the polls are showing, I don't think our governor is going to have his attorney general fight translocation. So my opinion is this law is not worth the paper it's written on. Alright, Washington State has its own endangered species law, and the grizzly bear has been listed as endangered in Washington State since 1980. Federally, they're listed as threatened. I want you to take a good look at this map on the right. This is the grizzly bear range and density map for North America. All of the colored areas are grizzly bear currently occupied zones. The tan area is historical range where the grizzly bear has been extirpated or removed from its range. One of the things I want you to look at, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, is that the highest densities of grizzly bears are along the coastal areas. But we do have a lot of grizzly bears in North America. Again, they're not an endangered species, but we're looking at the tan areas in Washington State where grizzly bears used to live, and actually still do live in most of those areas. But because of the lines on a map, the grizzly bear is listed as an endangered species in Washington State. This is a good time to take a look at corridors. Here's some examples of very small-scale corridors. These are called highway wildlife crossings. They're becoming more and more popular. In fact, we have one planned for Snoqualmie Pass. But these are probably a pretty good idea, I'm thinking. I mean, nobody wants to run into an animal on the highway, so if we can avoid some of those collisions and save some wildlife and save some human lives, that's a good thing. But I do want you to take a quick look at the highway wildlife crossing down in Banff. That's the lower left-hand picture. That's on the Bow Valley Parkway. And I want you to think about maybe a grizzly bear, moose, or elk that's maybe a mile or 2 miles down the road. Do they know they're supposed to come and cross where it's safe over here at this wildlife crossing? I mean, are they going to put up crossing guards? Are they going to try to train the animals? You know, there's a lot of highway here and only a minimal amount of crossing areas. So, you know, while these things can be effective, the bottom right on Highway 95 in Idaho and the middle one on Highway 95 in Idaho, these are undercrossings. They tend to be a lot less expensive. So folks, when you see these things, they look like wonderful projects. You know, it might feel good when you see them being built. You know, you're helping the environment. But there may be a cheaper way to do this, a more effective way to do this, and I would actually recommend taking a better look, a closer look at the cost-benefit of these things. Landscape scale corridors are really what we need to focus on here, folks. These are very large corridors necessary to connect wildlife populations, such as grizzly bears, that are separated by human settlement, development, or activity. Now, this U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service map is several years old. The numbers on there are easily double what's listed for these core areas for grizzly bears. Also, the bright green areas, such as all the zones south of Yellowstone, the Wyoming Range, and the Wind River Range, those are now core grizzly bear areas. They inhabit all those areas, as much of the Bitterroot and the area between the Continental Divide, Cabinet Yaak, and Selkirk is pretty well saturated with bears. They are all through that area, as I will show you when we get to the telemetry data pages. And also the North Cascades are receiving bears from our friends across the border in Canada. One thing I want you to look at here on the North Cascades recovery zone in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see a little separation, then a little green zone of potential habitat south of the North Cascades zone. That area is separated by I-90. So the wildlife corridor that's being built on Snoqualmie Pass has one of its design features, friendliness for bear travel, so that grizzly bears can make their way south from the core recovery area into areas in the southern Cascades and eventually into Oregon and the Trinity Alps in California, and you see how this all works. The Nature Conservancy just completed an 8-year study in conjunction with the Great Northern Landscape Conservation Cooperative, which we'll talk a little bit more about a little bit later, showing where the corridors need to be, priority corridors for, especially for large predators like the grizzly bear going across the northern part of Washington state. So the plans include all sorts of strategy as far as where conservation easements need to be, where landowner agreements need to be, cattle allotments that might need to be closed down, where land needs to be purchased or regulated to facilitate connectivity between isolated grizzly bear populations. I'm going to just talk very briefly about the Selkirk grizzly bear recovery area, because that does already come into a portion of northeast Washington state, that we already have a significant population of grizzly bears in that area. The estimate is 80 grizzly bears, but again, I believe that's a lowball number. And in every piece of literature you see that talks about the importance of connectivity and corridors, you will see the words, these bears are genetically isolated. You will see how important it is to make sure we have connections between these populations from one zone to another. And you will see that in all of the literature, regardless of the fact that we already have a lot of connectivity going on, and the idea is just to get more land. Well, the North Cascades grizzly bear recovery area is the crown jewel in all of this. It's being activated as we go through this program. There will be bears in the North Cascades very soon, and a lot of them. But we can't forget the Bitterroot recovery area. That is also going to be filled up with grizzly bears. They are already coming into the Bitterroots from the Selkirk area. They are crossing I-90. They are coming in from the Cabinet Yaak and from the Continental Divide, as I'll show you here in a little while with our telemetry data pages. Bears are also moving into Idaho from the Yellowstone area. They've been in Idaho for decades, and they're coming in more numbers now. So this will be next up on the agenda. The Selway Bitterroot will be filled with about 90 bears as far as their target numbers, and of course we always know their target numbers are just the lowball estimates of how many bears will eventually be in the Bitterroots. Just how many bears are we talking about? Well, you've got to quit looking at the maps given out by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and their underinflated numbers, and you've got to start looking at some of the information that we can get from our Canadian friends. And we're going to take a quick look here again back at the Selkirk zone up on the left-hand map. That looks kind of like an oven mitt, and when you connect it to the Selkirk zone on the Canadian side of the border, you start seeing a little bit bigger picture. If you look at the find that oven mitt in the right-hand map, it's where Washington, Idaho, and Canadian borders intersect. You'll see a little number 75. That was the estimated numbers of bears in that Selkirk zone. And you can start to see how that zone is connected to all the other little grizzly bear zones. You know, for some reason, these folks like to make these little puzzle piece zones and then add up the numbers in each zone as if those bears actually stayed in those zones, and as if those zones represented anything but lines in their own head, because the bears, again, do not care about lines on a map. You also notice some of the label says unknown, and there's just too many bears in those areas to be counted. They haven't really been counted accurately. Now, the Canadians do something that we don't do enough of, and that is they capture and collar a lot of bears. They have a lot of bears collared in these areas, and we have quite a few also collared, but not near in the numbers that our Canadian friends have. So they know exactly where a lot of bears are. That said, there are still a lot more bears who are not collared than bears who are collared. Okay, as you can tell, I love maps. We're going to see a lot of maps. I love these two maps. The one on the left, of course, is only available by our Canadian friends. You won't get radio telemetry data points from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It'll take you an act of Congress to get a hold of that information. So the Canadians do provide a lot more information to the public. So I get a lot of my information from the Canadian side of the border. The map on the left are data points of male and female bears, red and green, of individual bears taken over a period of a couple of years, showing where the bears are, where the core areas are, and where they like to travel. And as you can see, they do travel extensively into Washington State from the transboundary area shared with Idaho, Montana, and British Columbia and Alberta. The map on the right is very interesting. That was Ethel's journey. She was written up in the paper for quite a long time. She was even, I believe, on Fox News, did a story on her. She got in trouble over in Montana raiding an apple orchard. By the second time she came through to eat a bunch of apples, they captured her and one of her cubs. They put a radio collar on her, and then she decided to go for a little bit of a walk. She journeyed 2,800 miles in about 2 years' time, and she also hibernated during the winter. They actually were able to turn her collar off while she denned on the St. Joe River, just outside of St. Mary's, Idaho. And when they turned her collar back on in the spring, she had already bounced out and gone a couple hundred miles. She walked right through towns. She walked right through backyards. She rummaged in dumpsters. She went to landfills. She raided apple orchards. She ate anything that she found on her journey. She's a very independent bear, and she covered a lot of territory. The two lakes on that map, just to give you an idea of scale, are Flathead Lake in Montana and Ponderay Lake in Idaho. Her collar battery finally died, so after 2 years of tracking Ethel, she disappeared from the map. But again, they tracked her for 2 years. That's a 20-year-old bear at the time. She's probably about 30 right about now, and could very well still be trucking, still be producing cubs, and I just wanted to show you the extensive range that one bear can have. This map is kind of interesting. It is a map that was produced using telemetry data points. The dark green areas are where there are a lot of grizzly bears, or the core areas. The yellow zones are the corridors that bears have already shown a propensity to use, and they like to travel in those zones. So there could be grizzly bears in any of those yellow areas as well as the green areas, according to the data points. One bear was very interesting. He didn't have a name like Ethel, but he had a number. I don't know what his number is, so I'm just going to call him Bob. He was up in the northern Purcells in British Columbia, and he traveled due south. He was a young male. Most of the bears that roam, like wolves, are the younger males that can't compete with the dominant male in an area. And anyway, Bob traveled into Idaho. He came across the border in the middle of the night, I guess, because he didn't go through customs. They never saw him. He didn't have a visa. He just kind of came into this country illegally and headed south. He ended up just outside of Sandpoint, there on the shores of Lake Ponderay. He followed the Highway 2 corridor over to Priest River and Highway 57. He turned due north, went up to Priest Lake. There were too many tourists at Priest Lake. He didn't like all the noise from the boats, so he headed due west and came into Washington State. And as we all know, Washington State is a sanctuary state for wolves and grizzly bears. He's enjoying government housing, food stamps, all the benefits of being a alien in our wonderful sanctuary state of Washington. I presume he's raising a family and he's still here. We have no way of knowing because they won't tell us any more about his radio telemetry data. Okay, now we're going to really start getting into the nuts and bolts of rewilding. Take a look at the map on the upper right. That's again the North Cascades Grizzly Bear Recovery Zone. And only this time we're starting to see how it connects to the habitat, grizzly bear habitat in British Columbia. It kind of looks like a leaf there, the stem, okay? And then if you can look over to the map on the left, you can find that same top part of the leaf, the stem, Highway 1, connecting to the Cascade Mountains. That zone is connected to the other grizzly bear areas in British Columbia, and as you go up the coast you get into more and more densities of bears. One of the things I want you to keep in mind, and they've already discussed this, is the importance of bringing bears into the North Cascades from Montana and parts of British Columbia that are inland, and Idaho, North Idaho, and the Cabinet Yaak and the Selkirk zone, and bringing some of those bears into the Cascades because those bears are used to a mountain environment and living on berries and other animals, whereas the coastal bears in British Columbia are very much accustomed to eating a lot of salmon. So you can imagine if you were to drop some of those coastal bears into the North Cascade Grizzly Bear Recovery Zone, the first thing they're going to do is head down the rivers looking for the salmon runs. So it's very important to know the bears that you're bringing into the North Cascades. The second point I want to make is how long is it going to take those North Cascades grizzly bears to figure out there are salmon in those rivers, and when the salmon runs are, and they're going to follow those rivers down to the coast, and they're going to be in your backyards, folks. Just to emphasize that last point, you can see there's a lot of rivers flowing out of the North Cascades, and a lot of those rivers are full of salmon at certain times of the year. It won't take the bears, even from Montana and Idaho. They're going to figure out where the food sources are, the best food sources, the best protein sources are, and they're going to exploit those sources. I want to remind you also, bears love corn. They can do a great deal of damage to a corn crop. They love apples. They will eat cattle. They will eat sheep. They will eat just about anything they can get into their stomachs. They are stomach-driven animals, and they're not going to stay where they're put. Bears can travel a long ways, and they will. Okay, folks, we're going to switch to a different animal, an animal with different spots. That would be the jaguar, and you might be wanting to tune out at this point because you've heard enough about grizzly bears. You really don't want to hear much about jaguars. They don't seem to matter to you if you live in Washington State or Montana or Nebraska, but they actually should matter to you, and I'll explain why here in the next slide. I've only got 2 slides on jaguars, so it'll be real quick, but this is really important. Again, jaguar is an abundant species. It has an extensive range, and it is not listed as either endangered or threatened by the IUCN, and we'll talk a little bit more about the IUCN and why that's important here in a minute. But you do see the historic range in the light green extends up into the southern United States. And that's why it's important. It's important for every citizen of this country to know what's going on with jaguars on our southern border. In 2014, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service declared a jaguar critical habitat designation in Arizona and New Mexico, totaling 764,207 acres. That's a very small amount of land in comparison to the current range of the jaguars. Only 1/100th of 1% of the jaguar's current range, yet the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have determined that these areas were critical for the survival of jaguars. Currently, there are 0 jaguars in the United States. Over the last 50 years, there's a bit of controversy over how many jaguars have actually come across the border. I'm going to go with the number 4. That seems to be what most people accept as documented cases of jaguar sightings. And those were all males, of course. Males do tend to be the wanderers, the first ones to explore new territory. with exceptions, of course, but usually it's the males. One of the things I want you to look at are of course, the regulations and the mitigation strategies that come with these designations. Number one is that these areas must provide connectivity with Mexico. There can be no impermeable barriers constructed that will prevent jaguars from moving back and forth freely across the border. And if you see down at the bottom, I have a little 1/111. That is because the jaguar is named as one of 111 species, endangered species and otherwise, named in lawsuits to prevent the construction of any type of impermeable barrier constructed on the border with Mexico. These lawsuits are being formulated by all of the major conservation organizations led by the Centers for Biological Diversity, and of course the state of California is involved also. The Department of Homeland Security has Congress granted that agency a waiver against to prevent lawsuits like the ones being formulated. So this is all probably going to be headed to the Supreme Court, which is why there's such a vicious battle over a current nominee. Also, I would like you to look at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's own a draft recovery plan. It's 508 pages long. I just picked out a couple things to look at. The cost of this program is $605,648,000 over 50 years. The critical habitat that's been designated has been estimated to be able to support 6 jaguars. So that's about $101 million per jaguar. And that money is being spent. The bulk of it will go to conservation organizations, and this ought to outrage everybody. It's going to go to conservation organizations who will be paid to monitor these zones to make sure that all of the mitigation strategies and new regulations are being adhered to. No roads, no cattle, no nighttime lighting, that sort of thing. So your taxpayers' dollars going to these conservation organizations to promote rewilding. The other thing I want you to keep in mind, I know I'm talking a lot about this slide, but it's very important to understand these designations can be enlarged arbitrarily at any time by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They're stamped on a map and they can be made bigger just by proclamation. They don't have to go through the legislative process. The original plan that the Centers for Biological Diversity wanted was for 52 million acres to be critical habitat for jaguars, and that would have encompassed most of Arizona and New Mexico. I can guarantee you that down the line there will be lawsuits, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is not, they kind of feign resistance. They put up kind of a good show that maybe they're resisting these lawsuits, but they're actually working in partnership with the Centers for Biological Diversity, and they want these things expanded. So it'll happen, it's just a question of time. Well, there's 3 ways the federal government typically acquires land. That's through the legislative process, proclamations, or purchase. So examples of legislation might be wilderness areas, some national parks. And then you have proclamations. That would be national monuments. President Obama was really good at that. I think he set the record. I think he did about 33 national monument designations or proclamations using his authority under the Antiquities Act. Another example of a proclamation are these critical habitat designations and species recovery zones by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Those are just proclaimed without going through any legislative process. And then you have purchases. We have actually been part of our federal budget, we've been paying for the federal government to buy up private property at the rate of about $900 million. Specifically, 527.7 was for land purchases. That was a slush fund that has since been cut by the new Trump administration budget, so I'm happy to say that has happened. So I'm not as worried about this as I once was. But that can also be reinstated by legislative action and or by the next administration. So it is something to keep an eye on. I would actually hope that this thing gets audited, because I believe it was a slush fund for conservation organizations to actually purchase land and then sell it to the U.S. government, and then go out and purchase more land and just keep the ball rolling for rewilding. Anyway, until we get that agency audited, a full audit, we will never know the depth of corruption that was called the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Anyway, my question for you folks is, how does the Department of Interior prioritize which lands to acquire? Which lands need to be set aside as cores or corridors? How do they prioritize these lands? How do they know what to go after? Okay, that brings us to the gap analysis program. That was a joint venture between the University of Idaho and the USGS service. It was fully funded in 1993 by the Clinton administration. It had a very specific purpose. All land in the United States now has a corresponding gap status code attached to it, and or a United Nations IUCN numerical identifier. No exceptions. All land has a gap status code. Some of the land is under gap status code 0, which means totally unregulated or non-protected private property. It goes 1 through 4 for the other designations. The IUCN system is a little bit more complicated. They have up to 10 different numerical land identifiers, and those are broken down even further into little sub-identifications. So they're a lot more complicated than the gap status codes, but they're all based on gap analysis, which has 3 primary goals. Number 1 is to identify gaps that pose barriers to biological diversity between core areas and figure out how to get rid of those gaps and increase connectivity and species movement. The other one down at the bottom I've got there is management, how to regulate lands, how to acquire lands, what lands to acquire to facilitate species movement and connectivity. So a big part of gap analysis is identifying the barriers to species movement and what lands need to be mitigated and regulated to improve connectivity of species. Okay, here's the gap analysis map. This one is the stewardship layer for the Northwest region, 5 states here. Basically what you're looking at is all of the colored areas on this map. The legend, I'm sorry, is too small here, but you can go to the gap analysis page and find these maps. Very, very detailed maps. They go down to about 1/10 of a kilometer. They are zoomable. But all the colored areas represent government-owned lands, whether it's city, county, or state, or federal lands. They're all the colored areas on this map. What's left of private property are the white areas on this map, and of course each of these colored areas have their own specific gap analysis code, and like I said, it's zoomable down to the city park level. Okay, we look at Washington State statistics. We're at 56.63%. Still in private property hands in Washington State. That's pretty good compared to the Northwest region. Idaho, for example, is down to less than 28% of its land still in private property. But even our 56% is shrinking. We've got a 1.7% decrease since 1991. Also, that number doesn't include conservation easements, which are increasing, and also lands purchased by conservationists, rewilding advocates such as the Nature Conservancy or Vital Ground, or several others that are purchasing private property and then basically turning them into wilderness. They're just not doing anything with that land. It's all for conservation, all for rewilding purposes. That's not counted in the database because those are still considered private properties. Folks, I need you to wake up here. This is where we start the testing phase of this program. According to gap analysis, and like I said, it's extremely accurate, there are 9,493,391.3 square kilometers in the United States. My question is, first test question, what percentage of the United States is currently in the protected status category? Of course, it's a trick question. You have to understand what the word protected means and whose definition of protected are we using. Well, anyway, anybody want to throw a number out there, go ahead and take a guess. The answer will be on the next slide. If you said 13%, give yourself a B+. If you said 12.97%, give yourself an A. That equates out to exactly 1,230,637.0 square kilometers. We get this statistic from the United Nations Environmental Program World Database on Protected Areas, otherwise known as WDPA. At this point, you may be asking yourself a couple of questions. Why is the United Nations tracking how much land we have in protected status? And who really cares what the United Nations is doing? Well, you should care, and I hope as we get through this presentation, you'll see how all this ties together in the rewilding process. As an American taxpayer, you paid for all this stuff, so you probably should know what it is and how it's used. Gap analysis is used to build something called PAD-US, or the Protected Area Database of the United States. That is a map program and a searchable database that's extremely extensive, and I would really urge folks to get very familiar with PAD-US. Go on the internet, search it out, and you'll find all kinds of information, all kinds of map viewers, all kinds of species viewers that you paid for, so you might as well use them. I do. PAD-US then transfers the GAP data to the United Nations Environmental Program World Database of Protected Areas. We do that because we are obligated under the United Nations treaties, the Convention on Biological Diversity Treaty signed by President Clinton in 1993, and the UN 2030 SDA Treaty signed by President Obama in 2015. Now you might say, hey, these treaties were never ratified by Congress, they don't really mean anything, and you'd be completely wrong because the executive powers of the President include all of our land management agencies at the Department of Interior. So when they sign a treaty and they agree to abide by the rules, it all flows downhill through the Department of Interior into the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, the United States Forest Service, BLM, blah, blah, blah. And everything is recorded, processed, and reported back to the United Nations World Database of Protected Areas. And you can also go on that database and search any property in your city and town and find the IUCN designated numerical designation numbers. Now, when it comes to rewilding, the elephant in the room, of course, is the UN Convention on Biological Diversity Treaty signed by President Clinton in 1993. That treaty has 5 goals, 20 targets. They're very specific targets. Most are designed to be achieved by the year 2020. The one that I am concerned about is the 17% of protected areas that need to be designated. In the entire United States, 17% of all of our land needs to be designated as a protected area connected to other protected areas. Well connected, okay? So we're at 13% now. We were supposed to get to 17% by 2020. Of course, the problem is that the election didn't go the way that the United Nations and the rewilders wanted it to go, and we got kind of a loose cannon in there now, and President Trump, and everybody's panicking that we're going to fail to meet our international obligations. Again, you may say, well, who cares, and big what? But it is a very serious matter to the globalists, to the United Nations, and to probably half of the United States population. Well, we've come to about the halfway point of the presentation. Like I said, there's a ton of information here. We're going to start talking about landscape conservation cooperatives, but before we do that, this might be a great place to take that break you need. stretch a little bit, come back, and we're going to get into some pretty intense stuff coming up here. Landscape Conservation Cooperatives. Pay attention here, folks. Okay, welcome back, folks. We're going to look at Landscape Conservation Cooperatives. These were created by the Department of Interior. They are fully functioning entities, so you should know about them. You're paying for them. Also created at the same time are these entities called Climate Science Center regions. They're also on this map on the left. You can see the boxes. There are 22 landscape conservation cooperatives covering the entire United States. Landscape conservation cooperatives have been described as a new governance structure that bridges the geographic and jurisdictional boundaries of the complex socio-ecological systems in which landscape level conservation occurs. So I don't know about you, I must have been asleep when we voted on a new form of government, but that is exactly what these things are. One thing I want you to notice, I happen to live in what's called the Landscape Conservation Cooperative number 6, or the Great Northern Cooperative. That's the green one, kind of in the, you'll see it stamped there between Yellowstone and the Yukon. That should remind you of something. Used to be called Y2Y. That was an environmentalist dream back in the day. It is now a fully functioning reality. Taking a closer look at the Great Northern Landscape Conservation Cooperative, that's the one I live in. And I don't expect anybody to be able to read that tiny little font I have on the screen. If you can read it, you got better eyes than I do. But I wanted to list out all of the organizations that are, I don't know, I guess you would call them voting members, or at least contributors or partners in the Great Northern Landscape Conservation Cooperative, and that does include all of our state and federal agencies. And I highlighted in yellow all of the rewilding advocates, the conservation organizations that have been promoting Y2Y. Many of the same partners that were involved in Y2Y have just transferred over and are now involved in the Great Northern Landscape Conservation Cooperative. I included this slide because I'm going to be doing this presentation over in King County and wanted those folks to see what their landscape conservation cooperative looked like. Of course, this is a coastal area. The major issues on this area would be the ocean land interface, all the rivers, salmon fisheries, the islands, and of course also grizzly bears. And the thing to note about this is in this entire area region here, we're down to about 25% of private property, and that the bulk of that, of course, is in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. But this is your landscape conservation cooperative for you guys on the west side, and you ought to take a look at what they're doing, what they're planning, and what's coming out of these things that impacts your life where you live. So we do have to take a look at the nuts and bolts of rewilding, and this would be one of the nuts or one of the bolts, I'm not sure which, but it's called the North American Intergovernmental Committee on Cooperation for Wilderness and Protected Area Conservation. That's a mouthful. We just call it NAPA. This is the source of our binational and trinational protected area partnerships with Canada and Mexico. And again, the authorization for our Department of Interior agencies to negotiate international agreements with Canada and Mexico comes from the Endangered Species Act. In fact, it is required by the Endangered Species Act. The other thing to note about this particular group is it's facilitated by an organization, an NGO, called the Wild Foundation. This is a global conservation organization dedicated to the premise of rewilding. In fact, their motto is nature needs half, 50%. Now, if you understand that rewilding is a process, we're at 13% of protected lands in the United States. Our obligations and our agreements stipulate 17% by 2020. If you project that out to 2030, say maybe 30%, And in 2050, we may be getting to the 50% mark, which is the ultimate goal of protected lands. That portends a lot of changes in our form of government and the way we live over the next 33 years, folks. Some of you folks are going to be alive for 33 years. I don't plan on it. I'm just telling you what to expect if things continue to go the way they're going. Okay, let's take a quick look at the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. That treaty was signed by President Obama September 25th, 2015. The United States is one of 193 nations that signed and agreed to the terms of this treaty. Again, it was not ratified by Congress, but the President, through his directives and through his appointees, can set the agenda all the way down through all of our land management agencies, and he has done so, as did Clinton, and actually so did President Bush, but we'll take that up another time. Anyway, there are 17 goals in this treaty. The only one that I'm really concerned about is Goal 15. Actually, I'm concerned about all the other goals, but Goal 15 is the one that deals with our land management. It says sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, halt and reverse land degradation, and halt biodiversity loss. Now that sounds pretty good. I'm all for that, but that's not Goal 15, and you know how these things work. That's just the title of Goal 15. Goal 15 is actually quite massive. We'll take a look at a couple of key components of Goal 15 on the next slide. We're only going to look at a small portion of Goal 15. In fact, just the first sentence. That reads, by 2020, ensure the conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of terrestrial and inland freshwater ecosystems in line with obligations under international agreements. That, folks, refers directly to the Convention on Biological Diversity signed in 1993 by President Clinton. So rewilding is, above all else, a process with a specific goal in mind, and that is to get us to the 50% threshold of protected core areas connected by well-regulated systems of corridors to ensure biological diversity so that those grizzly bears don't become too inbred in their small little areas that we've given them. Now we're going to take a look at things that we can do, things that must be done if we're going to slow this agenda and get back to a multiple wise use lands policy. Rewilding will include, and it does include, increasing restrictions on all of our public lands. It will end the public lands grazing policies. It will end timber management. It will end any type of resource extraction from our public lands eventually. Again, it's a process, and we need to understand that. So let's take a look now at some of the things we could do and can do and are doing actually to slow this process down or reverse this process and get back to a common sense public lands policy that ensures species protection, but also does not involve squeezing humanity into islands of urban development while rewilding the rest of the planet. Okay, one of the things we can do is explode the myths surrounding rewilding or the field of conservation biology. Like I said, those are synonymous. I like the term rewilding because it's more descriptive. Conservation biology sounds scientific, but of course it is not. It is just a value-laden belief system that promotes rewilding. So there you have it. But now that we are armed with some of the facts about grizzly bear recovery and jaguars and what's really going on with our land management issues, we can influence other people, and that's basically where it's all about here is informing people and giving them the tools they need to talk to their legislators, talk to their neighbors, and bust these myths. I spend a lot of time on my blog doing just exactly that. I'm involved and connected to a lot of people who are also doing similar work. We formed quite a network on Facebook and email back and forth and share all kinds of information. It's nice to have a network of like-minded people, and we're bringing more people into our side of things as they get more information. So that's where the war is. It's over the minds of people who vote and are active in policies and care about this country. So with that, we'll move on, take a quick look at wolves. We could spend all day on wolves, but we're going to move on fairly rapidly through this. Words have meaning. Endangered species, for example, means a species of animal or plant that is seriously at risk of extinction. That is the biological definition, that is the scientific definition. Okay, this is a good slide. I said I'd talk a little bit more about the IUCN. That's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. They are made up of about 1,500 national and globally recognized conservation organizations. They do have the last say as far as endangered species and threatened species. It's called the Red List. And you can go on there and look up any species and look up its status. I don't argue with the fact that these folks are very accurate in their assessments of the species. Gray wolves, for example, have never been a threatened or endangered species. The IUCN lists them as a species of least concern. Same as the grizzly bear. And we ought to take that information and use it, because the United Nations and every nation on the earth looks to the IUCN as the global authority on these things. So, I've corresponded with the head of the IUCN's Red List just to ask more information about why we're dealing with wolves as an endangered species in the United States. And we had quite a conversation going back and forth there for a while, and he basically just said, well, they're endangered on the edges of their range. And of course that was just absolutely ridiculous. So yeah, these folks do have, you can question these folks, but as far as their listing goes, it is accurate. Back in the 70s, I was an advocate for grizzly bear recovery. I believed the grizzly bear was going to be the, quote, keystone species to push the rewilding agenda. I was wrong about that, because grizzly bears simply do not reproduce fast enough, nor do they acquire new range fast enough. So we had to have, 1995, 1996, we had to have wolves brought in from Canada and dropped into Yellowstone and central Idaho. They've been very, very effective at pushing the rewilding agenda. Again, we're talking about federal employees using the federal authority given to them under the Endangered Species Act, federally listed species under the Endangered Species Act, and dropping them in on federal land. So a lot of times the states don't have anything to say about this. They're just left to manage or clean up the mess that is left by our federal government. Okay, these two maps are actually mirror images of each other. The map on the left is the Defenders of Wildlife map showing gray wolf expansion. And the map on the right is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service map showing historical range of the gray wolf. You put these together and then you understand why the gray wolves are still listed as an endangered species, and I believe it's 33 states, so Kentucky, Louisiana, New York, Ohio, West Virginia, Tennessee, you name it, they're still listed on the endangered species list because they once lived there. And the agenda, of course, is to have them live there once again. We're seeing that spread all through the western United States first, and then, of course, in Minnesota and Wisconsin, Michigan, and into the North New England states as well. Of course, Arizona and New Mexico now have the Mexican gray wolves, and basically all these wolves are going to be blended together. Their range is going to be expanded. That's the plan, to have wolves live where wolves used to live all over the place. That's called rewilding, folks, by the way. So what's wrong with the Endangered Species Act? I got two answers here. One, allows the status of a species to be based on historic range. And it also allows for critical habitat designations and species recovery zones to be stamped on a map, bypassing the legislative process. These are two major flaws. Now, there are a lot of bills in Congress right now that seek to correct these flaws. If you're not involved in supporting your legislators or calling your representatives, you really need to be. If we don't fix the ESA, then in my opinion it's game over. It's the number one thing that has to happen to slow down or derail the rewilding agenda. Now, to flesh that out just a little bit more, I wrote this up. Determining the status of a species based on estimates of historic range, as the current Endangered Species Act is written, ignores factors such as real population levels, the sufficiency of current range, actual and perceived threats, projected future trends, the requirements of other species, and compatibility with human activity, human settlement, and human values. Just as a side note, you might notice that all the lawsuits that are designed to keep animals like gray wolves and grizzly bears listed as endangered species contain rewilding language, all of them. Those words like cores, corridors, connectivity, and keystone species can be found in the lawsuits. The unfortunate thing about that is these are all conservation biology terms. Conservation biology is, of course, a synonym for rewilding. I'd rather use the word rewilding because it's much more accurate, showing what these folks are trying to accomplish. But the fact is, judges are often more impressed by these unscientific, value-laden conservation biology concepts than they are with factual science. So when you go up against these folks, and I think it's important for our lawyers and our state representatives to understand, they need to get control of the language again, and they need to label this as rewilding, because that's what it is. Conservation biology sounds scientific, but it's anything but scientific. Okay, fact: gray wolves, grizzly bears, and jaguars are not endangered, and you can you can rest on that. That is a key fact, scientifically verifiable, that cannot be argued with. We need to present the facts of the impacts that rewilding has on human settlements and traditional rural lifestyles, on food production, on human health and safety. We need to look at the facts of what's going on and make sure the public understands the choices that they have to make here. The introduction of gray wolves alone has had a profound impact. We are seeing wolves replacing human hunters in the wildlife management models. They can severely depress ungulate populations and negatively affect many other species. You hear those the propaganda out there that wolves change rivers. That's absolutely ridiculous. But they do have severe impacts, and those impacts have to be looked at factually and objectively. They do not make the environment better. They do spread diseases. They do depopulate ungulate populations. There's very few moose, if any, left in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Last estimate was maybe 100 moose left. I'm doubting even that number. Nobody's actually seen a moose in Yellowstone for a couple of years now. They've wiped out a lot of the ungulate species that have really restricted hunting opportunities for human hunters. It's just a fact of living with wolves. You're going to have less hunting. You're going to have more cattle depredations. You're going to have more spread of disease. And eventually you're going to see rabid wolves coming into the picture. It hasn't happened yet, but we're going to see it. Speaking of rabid wolves, this is a map showing the characteristics of historic wolf attacks on human beings all across Asia and Europe. The blue areas are a combination where predatory attacks and rabid attacks have occurred. The purplish pink area there, mostly in Scandinavia, are where only predatory attacks have been documented. No cases of rabid wolves have been historically documented there, which is interesting. And in the yellow areas, we only have documentation on rabid wolf attacks in those areas. So, and in other areas, that doesn't mean wolf attacks didn't happen. There's just no documentation on that. But France alone has documented 7,600 fatal wolf attacks on humans between 1200 and 1920. Now, that's a long time, but it does happen. If you take a look at the picture on the lower right, that's Renee Anderson. She's a local area hunter. She was bow hunting actually, for elk on the Clearwater National Forest back in 2011 when this wolf popped out on the trail right in front of her and confronted her very aggressively on the trail. She dropped her bow and she pulled out her .44 caliber handgun and shot that wolf in the head at a range of 10 feet. She would have been one more statistic, and they say wolves never attack humans, or it's just so rare. I'll tell you right now, North America, the documentation of wolf attacks is rare because back in the Lewis and Clark days, they did have firearms and they did take shots at these things and keep them away. But if you're not carrying a firearm into the backcountry these days, or when you go camping or mountain biking with your kids, you're basically taking a big risk here. Okay, here's where the rubber hits the road. These are things that have to happen. These are things we must do or we lose the battle here. We need to immediately delist wolves, grizzly bears, and jaguars as endangered species. We need to rely on the scientific data. We need to take a bigger picture and not just look at little regional listings for these things, but look at the global picture of what's really going on with these species. And the number one thing, I should have it at the top of the list, is to repeal or amend the Endangered Species Act and the Equal Access to Justice Act. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but there is legislation in Congress and also at the state level. New Mexico's got a bill floating around that will change the state laws on endangered species. Washington needs to address that also. But at the federal level, Senator Barrasso from Wyoming and Bishop from Utah, they've got legislation going on now that needs to be supported. So you need to make sure you folks are getting on board with that. It will those legislative attempts to correct the flaws need to pass. If they don't pass, it's game over. Defunding the Department of Interior's Land and Water Conservation Fund, I got an asterisk there because that just happened. That could be refunded by the next administration, so that's something to keep in mind. Why should we be paying the federal government to purchase private property? And how does that happen? A Nature Conservancy or Vital Ground, they buy up some land, they get donations, buy up some land, they get grants and buy up some land, and then they can sell it right back to the federal government and then take that money and then go buy up some more land. So it is a slush fund. It needs to be carefully looked at. I'd like to see it be audited. I don't know if that's going to happen, but it'd be interesting to see where this money went. It's our money, and it'd be interesting to see what it went for. Okay. Also, we need to withdraw participation in specific UN treaties or ignore the requirements. I have faith in the Trump administration that they will simply ignore the requirements and act like these things aren't in effect. That's all fine and dandy, except that you got to look ahead at the next administration. Trump might not even make it 4 years, and if he does make it 4 years, that's great. Maybe it's great, I don't know. As far as land management issues go and multiple use land management, I do support what's going on with Ryan Zinke, and his viewpoints on multiple use are old-time stuff. It's stuff that needs to come back into vogue and get rid of the single-use land management that rewilding necessitates. Okay, and the biggest thing we can do is tell the truth. We need to expose the truth about rewilding. You folks here now fully understand what it is. I would hope that you would go to your legislatures, or you'd be able to sit in a meeting. You know more about grizzly bear recovery now than anybody else in the state, I guarantee it. Use that information, use that knowledge, and get out there and make a difference. Each of us can only do what we can do, but I think it's worth a shot. We've got a narrow window of opportunity now to make a difference. All these things are coming to a head. I think we need to be engaged and just share what we know and try to influence as many people as possible with the truth and with the facts. The truth does matter, folks, so proclaim it, get it out there. You folks are well armed now after you've looked at the rewilding agenda and how this thing works. I'm going to close with a personal story of showing an example of how the truth matters and why it's important to just stand your ground and keep speaking up about facts, about science, about human values, and what the rewilding agenda really is. Some of you folks may know who Temple Grandin is, may recognize her. I have the utmost respect for this person. Like I said, my career changed back in the 1980s, and I started working directly with people with developmental disabilities, and many of those folks had autism. So I was very interested in Temple Grandin when she wrote an article for Beef Magazine. Yeah, there is such a thing as Beef Magazine. The cattle industry understands who Temple Grandin is quite well, as she has helped that industry make billions of dollars. And most of the processing facilities for cattle do use her designs. She is currently a professor at Colorado State University. I believe she's about to retire, PhD. Very, very brilliant person. But anyway, she wrote this article that appeared in Beef Magazine, and she had gone to a presentation. Conservation biologist, a.k.a. rewilders, presented her with information about wolves and about how cattle producers and cattle ranchers were just going to have to get used to living with wolves. They presented her with a bunch of wolf management, what they call the toolbox, how cattle ranchers can keep the wolves out of their cattle by using flattery and noisemakers and range riders and livestock protection dogs. And one of the presenters also talked about how cattle had just become too domesticated and they needed to relearn their predator defense mechanisms. Well, of course, she wrote this article up about what was presented at the conference, and then she got ripped by cattlemen who said, "What are you talking about? Making cattle relearn their predator defense mechanisms. We've been breeding cattle for a couple thousand years now, trying to make them so they won't kill us or hurt us and be easier to work with, and now we got to make them more aggressive." I mean, it just sounded nuts. So she came under a lot of criticism, and of course I was a little bit alarmed by that article also, so I sent her an email, and she called me up about a week later, and she just wanted to talk about how her article had been misconstrued by the public. She was very upset by that, by the way. She was basically reporting on what was presented at the conference. Those were not her opinions. She was just writing it up as, here's what they are saying. And people had misconstrued that and put her name on it. And well, I told her, well, you really need to clear that up, and you need to get out there, and you need to write another article. And her response was, "I can't help it if people are so stupid they can't read what I've written and understand it." And I said, well, they didn't, and you need to get on that. And then I talked to her for probably a couple hours that first conversation. I had to go out in the backyard and pace back and forth, because you're talking to a genius here in Temple Grandin, who is extremely fact-based and extremely able to put things together and see what all this means. So I talked to her for quite a long time about wolves and about what we're dealing with here in Northeast Washington State, and about how all the wolf management tools in the toolbox are, they're just ridiculous. They don't work. They're ineffective. And I started sharing with her a lot of factual information. We started emailing, corresponding back and forth daily. I sent her so much stuff that she read and went through, and then she sent me a 2-word email reply after that, and she didn't actually use the word cow. She said something else. But we talked quite a bit on the phone after that, and she realized the big picture about what wolves were intended to do. She thinks rewilding and using wolves, spreading wolves all across the western U.S. is just insane. It's an attack on our food production. Driving ranchers off of grazing allotments is a horrible idea. She is very much an advocate for keeping cattle on grazing allotments and for multiple use of our public lands. She gets it. And that's the important thing, because this is a person who is very influential. She was listed in Time magazine a few years back as one of the 100 most influential people in the world, and that's not just the most influential women. She was listed right up there with Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and people who make a difference in our world. So when she speaks, people listen. She has earned the right to be heard. She has earned the respect of many, many people, including myself. And over my long, lengthy interactions with her on the phone and through correspondence, I understand that she gets it. She understands what's going on. So she is not someone to be trifled with. I think it's a coup because the Colorado State University is a seedbed for conservation biology. They have their own college. They promote rewilding on an international scale. Some of their staff actually went down to South America and became part of what's called the Papalacta Declaration, which the IUCN and the UN are now using to promote connectivity between core areas. So she's surrounded by rewilders. They wanted to get her on their side, and she's too smart for that. And I hope that I played a role in giving her the information that she needs, and that she was able to digest instantly, and she understands reality and facts. She doesn't deal in emotions, and she doesn't deal with abstractions, and she deals with basic facts, and that's very refreshing. Okay, here's an example of an email that Temple Grandin sent me. We corresponded for quite some time. She'd send me an article or a study, and I'd send her an article or a study, or maybe I'd send her 5 articles and 5 studies. She can digest a lot more, a lot faster than I can. Anyway, she wrote this up and sent it off to me. Basically, she had noted that in this particular article, the authors wrote that extirpating wolves across much of North America stopped wolves from killing sheep and cattle, but introduced a new sheep predator as coyotes spread across the continent. Basically, the authors were saying, well, we got wolves now, and everything's going to be the same. Nothing's really going to change. It's just that the wolves will be eating the sheep that the coyotes have been eating. So nothing's going to change for the livestock production community. They're just going to, trading one predator for another, no big deal. And she noted the holes in that right away, and she wrote that what the author does not realize is that ranchers have effective methods for guarding cattle or sheep against coyotes. Of course, one of the best methods is just plain shooting them. But anyway, methods that work against coyotes, such as guard dogs, do not work effectively against wolves. And that's a fact, especially these very large Canadian wolves. And we can go on about livestock production dogs. I sent her a lot of information on that. But anyway, she concludes with, wolves are a much more difficult predator for ranchers to defend against. And that's a fact. That's just a basic fact. So she gets it, and by sharing the truth with somebody like Temple Grandin, she is now able to share with everybody that she comes into contact with. And a lot of people will listen to Temple Grandin that don't know who the heck I am or who the heck you are. So it's important that we make contact with these folks who are in these positions. Again, it's a coup. The rewilders wanted Temple Grandin, and they didn't get her. So amen to that, right? All right, that wraps up my program, and I hope you guys will take this information and make something useful out of it. At least tell your neighbors, and when you vote next time, you'll know what you're voting on, and talk to your legislators about legislation, and you know how that stuff works. Speak the truth and go boldly.